My name is Rachel, and at 32 years old, I had built what I thought was a secure, respected career as a project coordinator at a boutique marketing firm in Seattle. My boss wasn't just my employer, she was my mother's best friend, a woman I had known since I was a toddler. She had been at every one of my birthdays, high school plays, and even my college graduation. She knew my favorite foods, my old heartbreak stories, and the exact shade of blue I always wore when I needed confidence. She wasn't just my boss, she was family, or so I believed. 3 weeks ago, I sat in her sleek, glass-walled office while the hum of the city poured in from the streets below. She folded her hands, looked me in the eye, and told me I was being let go, not for performance issues, not because the company was downsizing, but because, in her words, your sister is a better fit for the role, and this will help keep family harmony. Where are you watching from today? If you want to hear how I confronted the betrayal that cost me my career, hit subscribe now. I grew up in a modest but tidy neighborhood in Tacoma, Washington. Our split-level house had pale yellow siding, white trim, and a small garden my mother fussed over as if it were a competitive sport. The neighbors waved from their porches, kids played basketball in the cul-de-sac, and every 4th of July, someone on the block set off illegal fireworks that rained sparks onto our roofs. From the outside, we looked like an ordinary, well-functioning family: 2 daughters, a father who worked with his hands, a mother who managed the household and maintained a bustling social calendar. Inside, though, there was a clear imbalance that I learned to navigate early. My sister Emily was 2 years younger, but somehow always older in my parents' eyes, more deserving, more interesting, more worthy of their pride. She had a magnetic personality that drew people in without her even trying. Teachers adored her. Neighbors stopped her to chat. My mother often referred to her as my sunshine, while I was the reliable one. The one who made sure the bills in my name were paid on time, the one who remembered birthdays, the one who could be trusted to handle things without drama. Valerie, my mother's best friend and eventually my boss, was a permanent fixture in that dynamic. She and my mother had met in college and bonded over shared ambitions and a similar view of the world. People respected strength, not softness. They believed in working hard, looking polished, and never letting emotions cloud decisions. I grew up calling her Aunt Val, and she treated me warmly enough, though there was always an undercurrent of appraisal in her eyes, as if she were measuring how well I stacked up. By the time I graduated college with a degree in communications, Valerie had built her marketing firm into one of the most respected boutique agencies in the Pacific Northwest. She offered me a position almost immediately, saying she wanted someone she could trust in a client-facing role. It felt like a dream job: creative projects, strong mentorship, and a chance to prove myself outside of my family's shadow. For years, I thrived there. I earned client loyalty, met impossible deadlines, and even landed a major contract that doubled the firm's revenue for a quarter. Valerie praised me in front of the team, gave me holiday bonuses, and told me I had a head for business like hers. But even as I was building a reputation, I never forgot that my connection to Valerie was rooted in family ties. That invisible thread was both a comfort and a quiet source of unease. The shift began slowly, almost imperceptibly. Emily had been laid off from her job at a lifestyle magazine, and after a few weeks of finding herself, started stopping by the office just to visit Aunt Val. At first, she was a guest, sitting in the break room, catching up with me over coffee. Then she started helping with small tasks, answering phones, organizing files, running errands for Valerie. Within a month, she was there more days than not. I told myself it was harmless. Emily needed a boost, and Valerie was generous enough to give her something to do. But I couldn't ignore the way Valerie's tone shifted when she talked about my sister, calling her a natural, praising her fresh ideas, and hinting that she had a real future in the industry. I worked harder, stayed later, and volunteered for more challenging accounts, but it felt like trying to outrun a shadow that was gaining on me. And then came the morning that changed everything. Valerie called me into her office without warning. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, her makeup flawless, her perfume faint but unmistakable. The blinds were half closed, casting striped shadows across the carpet. I sat across from her, notebook in hand, ready to take instructions for whatever urgent project needed my attention. But instead, she began with, "Rachel, I hope you know how much I value everything you've done here." Her voice was soft, almost kind, and for a split second, I thought she might be promoting me. Then came the pivot. But after much thought, I've decided to make a staffing change. Emily will be stepping into your role. The air seemed to leave the room. My ears rang, my chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I might be sick right there in her pristine office. "Why?" was all I could manage. She didn't flinch. "This isn't about your performance. You've been excellent. But there's been tension in your family for years, and I think this change will bring peace. Sometimes work and family mix in ways that aren't sustainable. This will help keep family harmony." Family harmony. As if my career, my livelihood, was a pawn on the chessboard of my mother's lifelong favoritism. As if my sister's convenience mattered more than my years of dedication. I walked out of that office numb, my badge still clipped to my blouse, my mind replaying every late night, every weekend I'd worked, every personal sacrifice I'd made for the sake of the company, and all of it, just like that, erased by a decision made in the name of keeping the peace. What I didn't know then was that losing that job would unravel far more than just my professional life. It would force me to confront decades of quiet injustice, shatter my relationship with my mother, and push me toward a kind of independence I never believed I could claim. If you had asked me as a child whether I thought my parents loved me, I would have said yes without hesitation. Love wasn't the problem. The problem was the way that love was distributed, carefully measured, poured generously into my sister's cup, while mine received just enough to keep it from being empty. Emily was born when I was 2 years old, and I don't remember a time before her. From my earliest memories, she was the center of attention, the magnetic pull in every room we entered. She had a round face, big blue eyes, and a laugh that made strangers smile. People called her adorable, charming, a natural performer. She seemed to know instinctively how to pose for photos, how to make a story sound funnier than it really was, how to capture someone's complete attention. In contrast, I was quieter. I liked books, puzzles, and organizing my crayons by shade. I followed rules, didn't interrupt, and could entertain myself for hours. The kind of child adults often describe as easy. But in my family, being easy meant being invisible. My mother's best friend, Valerie, was around so often that she became part of the fabric of my childhood. She and my mother had this unspoken language, a rhythm in their conversations that excluded everyone else. They would sit at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, leaning in close to share opinions about people and situations with a mix of amusement and judgment. Valerie always carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her worth. She wasn't cruel to me, but she wasn't soft either. She would compliment Emily's hair or outfit, then glance at me and say something like, "Rachel, stand up straighter. You'll look more confident." It wasn't said unkindly, but it was always a correction, never unreserved praise. School years only made the differences more obvious. Emily was the one cast as the lead in the school play, the one who got elected to student council, the one whose art project was displayed in the hallway. I did well academically, straight A's in most subjects, but my achievements didn't draw the same kind of applause. My mother would say, "That's great, Rachel," but it was usually followed by, "Emily, remember to bring your permission slip for the field trip," as if my success was just background noise. There were small moments when the imbalance stung more sharply. Like the year I turned 10 and my birthday party was a modest gathering in our backyard with a homemade cake, but Emily's 8th birthday 2 months later was held at a gymnastics center with a rented party room and professional entertainers. Or the Christmas when I unwrapped a set of practical clothes while Emily got a digital camera she'd been hinting about for weeks. I learned not to complain. My father believed in keeping emotions contained. "Don't make problems where there aren't any," he'd say if I ever hinted at feeling left out. My mother's version was more polished. "You and Emily are different. We give you what you each need." I tried to believe her, but it was hard not to notice that what Emily needed was always more exciting, more expensive, more visible. By the time I was 12, I had started helping around the house more, partly to earn approval and partly because it was expected. I cooked simple dinners when my parents worked late, helped Emily with her homework, and made sure the laundry was folded before bedtime. Valerie noticed my reliability and once told my mother, "You're lucky to have Rachel. Most girls her age are glued to their phones." I remember feeling a flicker of pride, but it faded quickly when she turned to Emily and said, "And you, keep that spark. You're going to light up the world one day." High school was a lesson in endurance. Emily's social life exploded: dances, sports teams, weekend trips with friends. My mother became a full-time cheerleader for Emily's activities, while I focused on academics and part-time work at the local bookstore. Valerie would stop by our house sometimes, dressed in her perfectly tailored suits, and ask me about my grades. She'd nod approvingly, then spend twice as long discussing Emily's latest achievements. It wasn't malicious. It was just clear where the excitement was. I clung to my studies and my job as a way to carve out my own identity. I saved money diligently, opened a checking account at 16, and started researching colleges early. I wanted to leave Tacoma, to find a place where I wasn't constantly compared to someone else. But leaving physically didn't mean leaving emotionally. Even in college, calls home were filled with updates about Emily, her internships, her travel plans, her new friends. When I landed my first internship with a marketing agency in Seattle, my mother's response was, "That's nice, honey. Did you know Emily is thinking about starting a blog? Valerie says she has a gift for connecting with people." Valerie herself always seemed to hover just beyond the boundaries of our family, but with a kind of influence that was hard to ignore. She came to my college graduation and handed me a sleek card with a note inside. "Let's talk about your future. I think you could be an asset at my firm." It felt like an opportunity to finally prove myself in a space where talent mattered more than favoritism. When I started at her company, I worked harder than I ever had in my life. Early mornings, late nights, endless revisions for clients. I gave everything. For a while, I thought I'd finally stepped out of Emily's shadow. Valerie's praise was measured but real, and I told myself that whatever she thought of my sister, here, in this professional arena, I had earned my place. But looking back, I see now that the shadow had simply changed shape. Emily wasn't in the office then, but she was still part of every conversation between my mother and Valerie. I would walk into Valerie's office to drop off reports and hear them on the phone, laughing about something Emily had said or done. I told myself it didn't matter. I was building something for myself, and that was enough. I didn't realize how fragile that foundation was, or how quickly it could be taken away. When I first walked into Valerie's office as an employee, not just Aunt Val's niece, it felt like stepping into a different world. The walls were covered in framed campaign posters and glossy magazine spreads, proof of the firm's impact. The space smelled faintly of fresh coffee and expensive perfume, and every desk hummed with the low rhythm of creative work. Valerie gave me a tour herself, introducing me to the team with a proud smile. "This is Rachel," she said, as if my name alone was enough to explain my worth. "She's a fast learner and she understands how we do things here." I caught a few curious glances, people wondering if I was just there because of who I knew, but I ignored them. I was determined to prove myself. The first few months were a blur of client meetings, research, and long hours learning the firm's systems. Valerie didn't coddle me. If anything, she was tougher on me than on others. I told myself that meant she respected me enough to expect more. And slowly, I began to earn trust, not just hers, but the team's. I learned how to anticipate a client's needs before they asked, how to translate vague visions into concrete campaigns, how to stay calm when a project was on fire. I stayed late without being asked, volunteered for the accounts no one else wanted, and celebrated small victories quietly, never drawing too much attention. 2 years in, I landed my first major client on my own, a local, sustainable fashion brand looking to expand nationwide. Valerie praised my work in front of the entire office, and for once, it wasn't followed by a mention of Emily or anyone else. It was just about me. I remember driving home that night with the windows down, the city lights reflecting off the wet streets, feeling like I was finally building something solid. For several years, things stayed steady. My role expanded, my salary grew, and I had a small but reliable network of professional contacts. Valerie and I had a rhythm. She gave me autonomy, but was always ready to step in when big decisions needed her stamp. I thought we understood each other. Then Emily lost her job. It was at a lifestyle magazine in Portland, the kind of trendy position she'd always gravitated toward. She said the company was downsizing, but I suspected it had more to do with her inconsistent work ethic. Still, my parents acted as though it was a tragic injustice. At first, Emily's visits to the firm were casual, dropping by to meet our mother for lunch, swinging past my desk to say hi to Valerie. She was her usual charismatic self, laughing easily with the team, complimenting their outfits, remembering tiny details from brief conversations. People warmed to her quickly. Soon, Valerie began letting her help with small tasks. Just until she finds her next thing, she told me when I asked about it. Emily answered phones, ran errands, and occasionally sat in on brainstorming sessions for fun. It shouldn't have bothered me, but there was something in the way Valerie looked at her, eyes lit up, leaning in as Emily pitched some half-formed idea, that twisted in my chest. It was the same expression my mother wore when Emily spoke, the one that said, "You are the most interesting person in the room." I reminded myself that I had years of experience, that my position was secure. But the visits became more frequent. The helping out turned into taking over small accounts. And suddenly, Emily was being introduced to clients as someone we're training in-house. One afternoon, I overheard Valerie in her office on the phone with my mother. Her tone was warm, indulgent, the way it always was when they talked about Emily. "She's a natural," Valerie said. "Clients love her. She's got that spark you can't teach." I stood outside the door, file in hand, my stomach knotting. It was the same old story, just in a new setting. And for the first time since joining the firm, I felt something I'd worked so hard to avoid: replaceable. It started with the smallest things I told myself didn't matter. A client I'd been working with for over a year suddenly requested that Emily join our calls. At first, I thought it was because Valerie wanted her to gain experience. But then Emily started leading parts of the conversation. She'd throw out an idea she'd clearly thought of on the spot. Valerie would beam, and the client would nod along like it was brilliant. The weekly strategy meetings were next. I'd show up to the conference room with my notes and see Emily already seated beside Valerie, flipping through slides I hadn't even been shown. Sometimes I wasn't invited at all, only finding out afterward that the team decided on a new approach for an account I had been managing for months. One afternoon, I walked into the break room to grab a coffee and overheard two of my coworkers whispering near the fridge. "I think Valerie's grooming Emily for something bigger," one of them said. The other replied, "Well, she's got the personality for it. Rachel's great at execution, but Emily's got presence." Presence. That word stuck with me. It was the same intangible quality my mother always praised in Emily. The sparkle, the charm, the it factor. It didn't matter that I'd been the one keeping the campaigns running smoothly. To them, the shine was more important than the structure holding it up. Outside of work, my mother began making little comments whenever we talked. "Isn't it great that you and Emily get to work together? I think it'll be so good for the family." Or, "Valerie says Emily's really catching on fast. Maybe she can take some of the load off you." The subtext was clear. Emily's growing role wasn't a threat. It was a blessing. I was expected to see it that way too. But the real turning point came when one of my biggest accounts, the sustainable fashion brand I had brought to the firm, was quietly reassigned. Valerie told me the client wanted a fresh voice and that Emily would be handling the next phase of their campaign. I asked why I hadn't heard this from the client directly, and Valerie's tone shifted. "Rachel, sometimes these things aren't personal. We're making choices for the greater good of the company and for family harmony." That phrase made my skin crawl. Family harmony. I'd heard it my whole life, usually right before something was taken from me and given to Emily. The atmosphere in the office grew heavier. Emily was no longer just helping, she was leading. She took over my desk when I was out for meetings, started using my client lists, and even signed emails with the same title I had, though Valerie never officially announced any change. The team began deferring to her in ways they never had with me, laughing at her jokes, nodding when she repeated suggestions I'd made days earlier. I tried to keep my head down and focus on my work, but it was like trying to run in quicksand. No matter how much I accomplished, Emily's shadow stretched further. Valerie seemed almost giddy about it, pulling her into private discussions, taking her to lunches with potential clients, leaving me to handle the less glamorous grunt work. Then came the quarterly review. I'd prepared a detailed report of my contributions, expecting at least some acknowledgement of my efforts. Instead, Valerie flipped through the pages distractedly and said, "Rachel, you've been steady as always, but I want to talk about how we can transition you into more supportive roles so Emily can take on leadership projects. It's important for the family dynamic." There it was again. That phrase. It didn't matter that this was my career, my livelihood. In Valerie's mind, and in my mother's, it was all just an extension of the same system I'd grown up in. The golden child leads, the responsible one supports. I left that meeting with a sinking feeling in my stomach. Something was coming. I didn't know what or when, but I knew the ground under my feet was shifting fast. If work had become a place where I felt sidelined, home, or what passed for home in my adult life, was no refuge. My apartment in Seattle was quiet, orderly, and mine alone, but every phone call from my mother carried the weight of expectation I could never quite shake. She had started calling more often in the past few months, usually after catching up with Valerie. These calls always began the same way, with some story about Emily's incredible progress at the firm. "Valerie says Emily really nailed the presentation for that fashion client," she'd gush. "You should be proud. After all, you helped her get her foot in the door." It was meant to sound generous, as if I were the benevolent older sister paving the way, but I could hear the edge beneath it, the subtle rewriting of the story. Emily was succeeding because of me, but now she was outpacing me, and I was expected to applaud. When I didn't respond with enough enthusiasm, my mother would shift into persuasion mode. "Rachel, you have to understand. This is good for the family. Working together can heal old wounds. It's important that there's no tension between you and your sister." That phrase, "no tension," was the twin of Valerie's family harmony. Both were euphemisms for the same thing: keeping Emily happy, no matter the cost to me. At work, the changes were accelerating. Emily had her own desk now, positioned near Valerie's office. She was given access to project files I'd always handled alone, and she began reaching out to my clients directly without looping me in. When I confronted her privately about it, she smiled in that disarming way she'd perfected since childhood. "Oh, Val just thought it would be faster this way," she said. "Don't take it personally." Not taking it personally was impossible. My projects, my relationships, my role, they were being stripped from me piece by piece, and the people doing it were the ones who had known me my entire life. The tension followed me everywhere. Friends I confided in were baffled. "Why don't you just leave?" one asked over dinner. But leaving wasn't just walking away from a job. It was admitting defeat in a space I'd fought to claim as my own. And more than that, it was handing Emily a victory she didn't earn. Then came the family dinner. My mother insisted we all meet at her house for Sunday night, something we hadn't done in months. When I arrived, Valerie was already there, seated at the head of the table as if she belonged to the family as much as either of us. Emily sat beside her, animated and glowing as she recounted a recent client meeting, one I used to run before it was reassigned. As I poured myself a glass of water, I noticed the way my mother was watching Valerie. It wasn't just friendship, it was deference, the kind of silent agreement that had shaped so many of their shared decisions. I realized then that whatever was happening at work had been discussed in detail here, in this very dining room, without me present. Halfway through the meal, my mother leaned back in her chair and said, "Rachel, I hope you're being gracious about all these changes at work. It's important for Emily to have her moment, and it's important for you to be supportive." I set my fork down slowly. "I've been nothing but professional," I said. Valerie gave a small, polite smile. "And we appreciate that, Rachel. But sometimes, it's about more than professionalism. It's about doing what's right for the people you care about." It was the same language, over and over, smoothed edges covering the sharp truth. They weren't asking me to support Emily. They were asking me to step aside for her. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I drove home that night with the freeway lights blurring through my windshield, my grip tight on the steering wheel. The more I thought about it, the more I knew. This wasn't just some natural progression or harmless opportunity for Emily. It was a coordinated shift, a quiet coup, and I was the one being eased out. Over the next few weeks, the pressure increased. Valerie began forwarding emails directly to Emily instead of to me. Tasks I'd been responsible for years were suddenly team projects that I was barely included in. My mother kept reminding me to keep the peace, as though any resistance from me would be proof that I was the problem. I started noticing small looks between Valerie and Emily in meetings, tiny exchanges I recognized from childhood when my mother and Valerie would silently decide what was best for me without ever asking my opinion. It was all happening again, only now the stakes were higher. The final straw before the actual blow came during a Friday afternoon meeting. We were reviewing upcoming campaigns, and Valerie announced that Emily would be leading a high-profile launch for a national brand. Rachel will assist with logistics, she added, without looking at me. Logistics. The word landed like a punch. I had spent years in creative leadership, guiding campaigns from concept to execution, and now I was being relegated to scheduling and supply tracking. Emily glanced at me, just briefly, but I couldn't tell if it was sympathy or satisfaction in her eyes. That weekend, my mother called again. Her tone was sweet, but her words were deliberate. Rachel, Valerie and I think this new arrangement is really going to help the family. I hope you see it that way too. It's not about who's better. It's about balance. I knew then that balance was just another word for erasing myself so Emily could shine without shadows. And I knew, deep down, that the real blow was coming. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning at 8:12 a.m. Subject, meeting, 10 a.m. No agenda, no details. Just an instruction to bring any outstanding reports. I stared at it for a long moment, a knot tightening in my stomach. Valerie rarely sent vague emails. If she wanted to talk, she usually stopped by my desk herself. This felt different, formal, distant. At 9:58, I walked down the hallway toward her office, reports in hand. The glass walls reflected my own uneasy expression back at me. Valerie was seated behind her desk, immaculate as always. Navy blazer, hair in a precise twist, a hint of perfume in the air. Emily was not in the room, which should have been a relief, but the emptiness only made the tension sharper. "Rachel, come in," Valerie said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. I sat, placing the reports neatly on the desk. "You wanted to see me?" She folded her hands, took a breath, and began. "Rachel, I want to start by saying how much I value the work you've done for this firm. You've been consistent, dependable, and professional." It sounded like the beginning of a compliment, but the way she paused made my chest tighten. I'd heard that rhythm before, soft words before a hard blow. "That said," she continued, "I've decided to make some changes in the structure of the team. Emily will be taking over your current role, effective immediately." My ears rang. "Excuse me?" "This isn't a reflection on your performance," she said quickly, as if rehearsed. "It's about the bigger picture. Emily has a unique ability to connect with clients, and I believe this move will strengthen the firm's future. And," she hesitated, just briefly, "it will help keep family harmony." There it was, the phrase that had been stalking me for months, the same justification I'd heard since childhood whenever something was taken from me. I swallowed hard. Family harmony? "Valerie, this is my career. You're replacing me with my sister, someone with a fraction of my experience, because you think it'll make my mother happy?" Her expression didn't change. "It's not about making anyone happy. It's about avoiding unnecessary conflict. Sometimes the right business decision also serves a personal need." The air in the room felt heavy, pressing down on my chest. I glanced at the reports in front of me, the evidence of years of work, late nights, and client wins. None of it mattered. "I've given this company everything," I said quietly. "And we appreciate that," she replied. "Which is why I'm offering you a generous severance package. You'll have time to find something that suits you, something less entangled with family." The words stung, less entangled, as if I were the one who had blurred the lines, when in reality, those lines had been drawn around me from the start. I didn't remember standing up, but suddenly I was on my feet, my hands gripping the back of the chair. My voice shook, but I forced the words out. This isn't about harmony, Valerie. It's about picking a favorite. You've been doing it since we were kids, you and my mother both. I just never thought you'd take it this far. She didn't flinch. I'm sorry you feel that way. That sentence, cold, polished, and meaningless, was the final confirmation that nothing I could say would change her mind. I gathered my reports, though I had no reason to keep them now, and walked toward the door. My reflection in the glass looked pale, eyes wide, like I'd just stepped out of an accident. Rachel, Valerie called softly. I stopped but didn't turn around. You're talented, you'll land on your feet, she said. This is for the best. I walked out without replying. The hallway felt longer than usual, every step echoing too loudly in my ears. At my desk, I sat down mechanically, opened my drawer, and began clearing it out. My co-workers avoided my eyes, their hushed voices carrying just enough for me to know they already understood what had happened. Emily arrived an hour later. She looked surprised to see me packing, but not surprised enough. Val told me she spoke to you, she said, her voice light, almost cautious. I kept my gaze on the box in front of me. Congratulations on your promotion. Her cheeks flushed. Rachel, it's not like that. She just thought... I know what she thought, I cut in, sharper than I intended. And I've heard the speech before. She didn't reply. After a moment, she walked away, leaving a faint trail of her floral perfume in the air. By noon, I was gone. I stepped out of the building into the cool Seattle air, the city buzzing around me like nothing had happened. But for me, everything had changed. I sat in my car for a long time, watching pedestrians pass, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The job had been more than a paycheck. It had been proof that I could hold my own, that I could build something independent of my family's warped dynamics. And now it was gone, taken under the same banner that had excused every slight, every theft of opportunity in my life, family harmony. Driving home, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. Part of me wanted to call my mother and demand an explanation. Another part knew exactly what she'd say, that this was better for everyone and that I should be happy for Emily. But I wasn't happy. I was done. When I walked into my apartment that afternoon, the silence felt heavier than usual. My box of desk items sat on the kitchen counter like an accusation. Photo frames, a coffee mug, a small potted plant I'd kept near my monitor for years. Each object felt like a fragment of a life I no longer had. I dropped my keys in the bowl by the door and stood there for a moment, staring at nothing. The day had been so abrupt, so surreal, that I wasn't sure I'd fully processed it. One morning, I had a career. By lunch, I was unemployed, replaced by my own sister. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from my mother. Mom, I heard from Val. Call me tonight. We need to talk. The phrasing was telling. We need to talk had never meant I want to hear how you're doing in my family. It meant I'm going to tell you how to feel about this and you're expected to agree. I ignored it at first, making myself a cup of tea I barely touched. By evening, though, the dread of the inevitable conversation was too much. I dialed her number, my stomach in knots. She answered on the first ring. Rachel, I'm glad you called. Valerie told me everything. I took a slow breath. Then you know I was fired. Let's not use that word, she said, her tone brisk. She made a staffing change. These things happen in business. Staffing change? She gave my job to Emily. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but no less controlled. Rachel, you have to see the bigger picture. This will make things easier for everyone. You and Emily have been at odds for years. Working together like that would only create tension. I gripped the phone tighter. There was no tension until you and Valerie created it. That's not fair, she said sharply. Valerie has always looked out for you. She gave you that job in the first place. Yes, and I worked hard to keep it. I earned my place. And now it's time for Emily to have her chance, my mother replied, as if that settled everything. You're strong enough to move on. She needs this more than you do. It was the same logic I'd heard my whole life, Emily's needs outweigh mine because I'm strong enough to survive without. But strength didn't mean I was unbreakable. I have to go, I said finally, ending the call before my voice cracked. I didn't cry right away. Instead, I sat on the couch in the dim light, scrolling through my contacts and hesitating before texting anyone. How do you even begin to tell people something like this? Hey, remember that job I loved? My boss, who's also my mom's best friend, just gave it to my sister. Eventually, I messaged my friend Claire. She'd known me since college, one of the few people who truly understood my family's patterns. Me, I lost my job today. Valerie replaced me with Emily. Claire, what? Are you kidding me? Me, nope. For family harmony. Claire, that's insane. Come over. I'm opening wine. I didn't go over. I didn't want to face anyone in person yet, but her outrage was a small comfort. At least someone saw it for what it was. Later that night, Emily called. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some stubborn part of me wanted to hear what she'd say. Rachel, she began cautiously, I know this is weird. I didn't ask for this, you know. Didn't you? I said quietly. She hesitated. Val thought it was best. I didn't want to cause problems. Then you could have said no. There was silence on the other end. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. I'm sorry you feel hurt. The words were hollow, polite, rehearsed, the kind of apology that admits nothing. Enjoy the job, Emily, I said, and hung up. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed the day in looping fragments. Valerie's calm delivery, my mother's justification, Emily's feigned innocence. It wasn't just about the job, it was about being erased, again from a place I'd fought to belong. The next morning, my inbox was already full of LinkedIn notifications. Word travels fast in certain circles, and in a firm as tight-knit as Valerie's, it travels faster. A few colleagues sent polite messages wishing me luck in my next chapter. Others didn't bother. By midday, I decided to get out of the apartment. I walked to a coffee shop a few blocks away, one I'd gone to often before work. The barista recognized me and asked if I was on a late start. I forced a smile and said I was taking some time off. As I sat there, watching people rush past the window, I realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, I had nowhere I needed to be. No deadlines, no morning meetings, no clients waiting for updates. The freedom should have felt liberating, but instead it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with no idea what was below. When I got home, I saw another text from my mother. Mom, I hope you're not angry with Emily. This is a blessing in disguise. I didn't reply. I wasn't ready to hear that losing everything I'd built was somehow a gift. Instead, I opened my laptop and began updating my resume. I didn't know yet what I was looking for, only that it wouldn't be anything connected to my family. The first week after I lost my job felt like living underwater. Sounds were muffled, movements sluggish. I woke up every morning at the same time as before, only to remember there was nowhere to go. My desk at home became a landing spot for unanswered emails, job postings I wasn't ready to apply for, and a growing stack of unpaid bills. By the third day, I decided to see if there was any way to fight back. Valerie had dressed my dismissal in polite corporate language, but I knew it was personal, and I wanted to know if it was legal. I made an appointment with an employment attorney recommended by a friend. His office was small, tucked into a brick building downtown. He listened patiently as I laid out the story from the beginning. The years I'd worked for Valerie, the gradual erosion of my responsibilities, the favoritism toward Emily, and finally the meeting where I was told my job was being given to her for family harmony. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. Rachel, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Unless you have written evidence that your firing violated a specific law, discrimination, retaliation, breach of contract, this is going to be a hard case to make. Washington is an at-will employment state. They can replace you for almost any reason as long as it's not an illegal one. So they can just hand my job to my sister because my mom's best friend thinks it'll keep the peace? He gave me a sympathetic look. Morally wrong? Absolutely. Legally actionable? Probably not. It was exactly what I didn't want to hear, but at least it was honest. I thanked him and left, the cold air outside stinging my face. Any hope I'd had of holding Valerie accountable in a courtroom evaporated. Back in my apartment, I tried to distract myself with small tasks laundry, cleaning, reorganizing shelves, but the outside world had a way of slipping in. On social media, the firm's page posted a photo of our new account lead, Emily, smiling at the camera in a tailored blazer. The caption gushed about her natural leadership and fresh creative vision. I stared at it for a long time, my chest tightening. It wasn't just that she had my job, it was that she was stepping into it without hesitation, without acknowledgement of what had been taken. The news spread quickly in our community. People I barely knew reached out with vague messages. Heard you're making a change. Hope it's for the best. Others didn't bother with pleasantries. One neighbor at my parents' church apparently asked my mother if there'd been a falling out. She laughed it off, saying, "Rachel just needed a break. Emily was ready to step up." A break. As if I'd simply decided one day to hand over my livelihood like an unwanted sweater. The isolation was worse than the anger. Friends who didn't understand the depth of my family's history saw it as just another career setback. "You'll find something better," they'd say, meaning well but missing the point entirely. This wasn't just about work, it was about the same pattern playing out again, only now the cost was higher than ever. One afternoon, I ran into an old coworker, Jenna, at the grocery store. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, but then she lowered her voice. "I just want you to know everyone in the office knows how unfair that was. But no one's going to say it out loud. She's Valerie." It was a small relief to hear someone acknowledge it, even if it didn't change anything. I tried to focus on practical steps, networking, updating my portfolio, applying for jobs outside of Seattle where my family's reach was shorter. But every time I sent in an application, the thought would creep in. What if they call Valerie for a reference? She had the power to color my future as easily as she'd rewritten my past. Meanwhile, my mother called regularly, still convinced this was a good thing in the long run. She told me about Emily's successes at the firm, as if they were family achievements I should share pride in. I learned that Emily had taken over my old client accounts seamlessly and was already being considered for a leadership role in the firm's expansion plans. "Doesn't it feel good to know you helped her get there?" my mother asked once. I almost laughed. "No, Mom. It feels like I was shoved out of the way so she could get there." Her sigh was heavy, the kind that said I was being unreasonable. "Rachel, life isn't always fair, but we're still family. You can't let this come between you." As if it hadn't already come between us years ago. The one thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't stay still. If I stayed in Seattle, I'd keep running into Valerie's name, Emily's face, and reminders of what I'd lost. I needed space, physical, emotional, everything. I began quietly making plans to leave. I applied for jobs in other states, places where my last name wouldn't immediately be connected to Valerie's firm. The idea of starting over from scratch was terrifying, but the alternative was worse. Staying trapped in the same cycle, waiting for the next inevitable blow. In the meantime, I kept my distance from family gatherings. My absence was noticed. My mother left voicemails urging me to come. Emily sent occasional texts asking if I was still mad, but I knew that showing up would mean plastering on a smile while watching my sister thrive in the role I'd built, with my mother and Valerie applauding every step. The truth was, I didn't just feel unemployed, I felt erased. Leaving Seattle wasn't a sudden decision. It began as a whisper in the back of my mind, "You can't heal here," and grew louder each time I passed a street I used to walk on my way to work or saw Valerie's firm mentioned in a local magazine. The city I'd once loved had become a map of reminders. I applied for jobs everywhere: Denver, Minneapolis, Nashville, places I'd never lived but could picture myself starting over. The first real bite came from a design agency in Portland. The position wasn't identical to my old role, but it was creative, client-facing, and, most importantly, far enough from my family's orbit to breathe. After 2 rounds of interviews, they offered me the job. Packing my apartment was a bittersweet process. Every object carried a memory: the framed client award from my 3rd year at the firm, the blazer I'd worn to pitch my first major account, the coffee mug Emily had once given me for Christmas that said "World's Best Sister" in cheerful blue letters. Some things went into boxes, others into donation bins, and some, like that mug, straight into the trash. The day I left, the sky was gray and heavy, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather I'd grown up with. As I drove south on Interstate 5, the city skyline shrank in my rearview mirror. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Mom, wishing you the best in Portland. Don't be a stranger." There was no acknowledgement of why I was leaving or what had led me here, but I didn't reply. I needed this distance, and for once, I didn't feel obligated to explain myself. The first few weeks in Portland were a mix of relief and disorientation. My new apartment was smaller but bright, with big windows that let in the soft morning light. The streets were unfamiliar, the coffee shops different, the pace slightly slower. I walked to work most days, letting the rhythm of my steps ground me in a city where I was no one's daughter, no one's sister, no one's employee to be quietly replaced. At the new job, I kept my head down at first. My coworkers were friendly, but curious, asking about my move from up north. I gave vague answers, just looking for a change, and steered the conversation back to work. I wasn't ready to unpack the whole story for strangers. Still, the work itself was a balm. The projects were challenging in a good way, the clients respectful, and the office culture refreshingly free of the unspoken hierarchies I'd endured before. Here, ideas mattered more than bloodlines. Even so, the wounds from Seattle didn't heal overnight. There were days I caught myself bracing for favoritism that never came, or flinching when a manager called me into their office. My body still carried the memory of that glass-walled meeting with Valerie, the sound of her voice as she told me I was being replaced. That's when I decided to try therapy, something I'd always told myself I didn't need. I found a counselor named Dana who specialized in family dynamics and workplace trauma. In our first session, I told her the whole story, from childhood favoritism to the moment I carried that box of my belongings out of the firm. She listened without interruption, then said something that stuck with me. "Rachel, you've been trained to see yourself as the one who can handle anything. That's why they feel entitled to take from you. Part of your healing will be learning that you don't have to be the strong one all the time." I left that session feeling like she'd peeled back a layer I didn't know existed. Over the next months, therapy became a space where I could unravel the patterns I'd lived in for decades. I learned that my mother's version of love was conditional, tied to how well I maintained peace in the family. I learned that Valerie's mentorship had always been transactional, rooted in her alliance with my mother rather than genuine investment in me. Most importantly, I learned that my worth wasn't defined by how much I could endure. Outside of work and therapy, I began building a new life in small, deliberate ways. I joined a weekend hiking group, rediscovering the joy of being outdoors without the weight of family drama. I took a pottery class on Thursday nights, my hands shaping clay into uneven bowls and lopsided mugs that somehow felt like progress. I started cooking again, not rushed meals between late nights at the office, but real, nourishing food for myself. Some nights, loneliness crept in. It was strange to be in a city where no one knew my history, where I could disappear entirely if I wanted to. But there was freedom in that too. I didn't have to perform the role of the good daughter or the responsible sister. I could just be Rachel. Around the 3-month mark, something shifted. I realized I hadn't checked the firm's social media in weeks. I didn't know what Emily was working on, and I didn't care. The part of me that once needed to track her every move, out of competition, out of hurt, was quieter now. My mother still called occasionally, her tone light and breezy, as if nothing had happened. I answered less often, and when I did, I kept the conversations short. She never apologized, never acknowledged the betrayal, but I was beginning to accept that she might never see it the way I did, and that I didn't need her validation to move forward. By summer, I'd settled into a steady rhythm. My work was going well enough that my manager asked if I'd be interested in leading a new campaign. The old me would have hesitated, afraid of stepping into a spotlight I might be pushed out of. But now, I said yes without overthinking. The project was a success. When it wrapped, The client sent an email praising my leadership and creativity. My manager forwarded it to the whole team with a note. Rachel knocked this out of the park. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. Praise here wasn't a trap or a setup for someone else to take credit. It was real. That night, I walked home along the river, the sunset turning the water gold. For the first time since leaving Seattle, I felt something close to peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because I'd stopped defining myself by the people who had hurt me. Healing wasn't a straight line. There were still moments when I thought about that day in Valerie's office, still flashes of anger when I imagined my mother and sister celebrating Emily's success. But those moments didn't consume me the way they once had. I was building something new, not just a career, but a life that belonged entirely to me. And no one, not my mother, not Valerie, not Emily, could take that away again. A year after I left Seattle, my life didn't look anything like the one I'd planned, and that was exactly what made it beautiful. The apartment in Portland had become more than a place to live. It was my sanctuary. There was no trace of corporate sterility here, just the warm hum of a space that reflected me. My plants had grown wild on the windowsills, some trailing down toward the floor like green waterfalls. The bookshelf in the corner held not just novels and memoirs, but pieces of my new life. A lopsided ceramic bowl from pottery class, a framed photo of the hiking group at the summit of Dog Mountain, a little stack of postcards I'd started sending to myself from places I visited. Mornings here began quietly. I'd wake before the city's noise fully stirred, make a cup of coffee in my chipped navy mug, and sit by the window watching the sky shift from pale gray to gold. No rush, no knots in my stomach, no rehearsing conversations in my head before walking into Valerie's office. At work, I was no longer the shadow in the room. I led projects from start to finish, made decisions without someone hovering, and earned respect based on my contributions, not because of who I was connected to. The culture here was different. There were disagreements, yes, but they were handled in the open without whispers or side deals. Success didn't come at someone else's expense. The biggest change, though, wasn't my job. It was me. Therapy had taught me that I'd been trained to measure my worth in endurance, how much I could take, how long I could carry burdens without complaint. That conditioning had made me the perfect person to exploit. At work, in my family, in friendships that drained me dry. But somewhere along the way, I stopped confusing endurance with strength. I learned the difference between boundaries and walls. In the early months after leaving, I'd built walls so high even friends had trouble reaching me. I declined invitations, kept my phone on silent, convinced that shutting everyone out was the only way to stay safe. But over time, I replaced those walls with boundaries that made sense, lines that protected me without isolating me entirely. With my mother, that meant limited contact. I answered her calls when I felt ready, not out of guilt. Our conversations stayed in safe territory. The weather, family recipes, the occasional neutral update. If she mentioned Emily's latest accomplishments, I let the words pass through me like smoke instead of letting them burn. Emily herself had reached out less and less. There was no apology, at least not one that meant anything, but I sensed she understood that whatever we'd once had was now gone. The wound had closed, but in its place was a scar that kept us at a polite distance. Then came the call I didn't expect. It was a gray Tuesday in early September. I was walking back from a client lunch when my phone lit up with an unknown Seattle number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Rachel, it's Jenna," said the familiar voice of my old coworker. "I hope this isn't weird, but I thought you should know. Emily left the firm." I stopped mid-step. "She left?" "Yeah. I don't know the whole story. Valerie's been tight-lipped, but apparently Emily wanted to pursue other opportunities." There was a faint smirk in her voice. "Guess family harmony has an expiration date." When I hung up, I didn't feel the rush of satisfaction I thought I might. There was no triumphant, "serves her right," no cinematic moment of vindication. Just a calm, steady certainty. Whatever had happened between them was theirs to deal with. I wasn't in the middle anymore, and I had no desire to be. That night, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, the city lights twinkling below. A year ago, I'd been certain that losing my job had destroyed me. Now I could see it for what it was, the start of something I hadn't dared to imagine, a life where my worth wasn't measured against my sisters, where my voice didn't have to fight to be heard. It's strange how grief works. At first, you think you're mourning one thing, the job, the salary, the title. But as the layers peel back, you realize you're grieving the illusions you lived inside. I'd believed that loyalty and hard work would eventually be rewarded, that if I proved myself enough, my family would finally see me. But they'd been looking past me my entire life. Leaving Seattle hadn't just been about escaping Valerie's betrayal or Emily's promotion. It was about finally stepping out of a spotlight I was never truly in and finding my own light somewhere else. Now, family harmony means something different to me. It used to mean swallowing my feelings, erasing myself, keeping everyone else comfortable. Now it means peace in my own home, in my own head, a harmony I build for myself. On my living room wall hangs a framed print that says, "You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep others warm." It's the first thing I see in the morning, a reminder I wish I'd had 20 years ago. By winter, my life had a rhythm I loved. My weekends were filled with hikes, art fairs, and cozy afternoons in the pottery studio. I had friends who knew the whole story, who didn't minimize it or tell me to just get over it. I had a job that challenged me without consuming me. And I had silence where there used to be constant noise. One evening in January, I got an email from a young woman who had interned at Valerie's firm during my last year there. She wrote, "I don't know if you remember me, but I wanted to say thank you. I saw how you handled yourself when things were unfair, and it made me rethink how I let people treat me. I've left that environment too, and I'm starting fresh." I read it twice, my throat tightening. All that time, I'd thought I was invisible. I hadn't realized that someone had been watching, quietly learning from the way I refused to fall apart in public. That night, I understood something I'd missed all along. The impact we have isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes surviving with dignity in a place that tried to erase you is its own kind of victory. I won't pretend I never think about what happened. There are still moments, quiet mornings, random songs on the radio, when a memory will surface. The sterile chill of Valerie's office, my mother's voice telling me Emily needed this more, the feeling of carrying that box out into the gray Seattle air. But those memories don't hold me hostage anymore. They're just part of the story, not the whole of it. The rest of the story is this. I built a life that belongs entirely to me. I decide who gets to be in it. I decide what I will and won't sacrifice, and I no longer confuse loyalty with self-erasure. If you've ever been told to give up something you love in the name of keeping the peace, hear me when I say this. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to say no. And if your refusal costs you people who only valued you for what you could give, let them go. The right people will never ask you to disappear so they can feel comfortable. My name is Rachel, and I lost a job I thought defined me. But in losing it, I found something better: freedom, peace, and the knowledge that my worth was never theirs to decide. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Your voice matters, and your story deserves to be told.